Welcome, brave listeners, to Wilhelm Presents Frightening Tales. I'm your host, Wilhelm. Tune in each week where I entertain my listeners with another dark and creepy tale of the paranormal, donated by authors from all over the world. If you are an author of some paranormal fiction and would like to share a story with my listeners, submit one at frighteningtales.com. And while you're there, tune in for more than 100 episodes of previous content. Today's episode is written by Steve Loiaconi, a journalist and graduate of George Mason University's MFA program. His fiction previously appeared in Griffel, the Mystery Tribune, Mythaxis, Zooscape, and the Saturday Evening Post, as well as the anthologies Open All Night, Why Didn't You Just Leave? And Found, too. He lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife, son, and dog. More of his work can be found at steveloiaconi.wordpress.com. I'll provide a link in the notes. And now, his dark tale, The Girl on the Porch. From the case files of Roy Murtaugh, paranormal investigator and licensed chimney sweep. The first thing you learn when you're hunting ghosts is there are no happy endings. If you don't find anything, well, you've wasted your time and money and likely embarrassed yourself in front of however many people to whom you swore you weren't just seeing things and you absolutely weren't crazy. If you find something, then, well, you're dealing with a ghost. And that is, to say the least, not an ideal situation for anyone. And this is what I tried to tell Keith Solomon. But people don't listen. It started one night a couple months back. Keith was laying in bed, wide awake, and listening to Mary, his wife of almost 5 years, snore up a storm. Watching her chest rise and fall, trying to ignore the whistling of the wind and the scraping of the windows by the skeletal limbs of trees he was convinced would teeter over and take out his roof in a bad storm. He was hesitant to look at his phone at times like this because the light of the screen would sometimes wake Mary. And that was a fight he'd had too many times. Still, he couldn't sleep, and he didn't especially want to be alone with his thoughts. So, he decided to scroll through his social media feeds, see what urgent nonsense the world was outraged about that would probably be forgotten by morning. Anyway, they had one of those doorbell cameras that send you an alert anytime someone or something triggers the motion detectors. A notification came through, but he didn't think much of it, assuming it was just a hungry raccoon or an overzealous squirrel. Then the doorbell rang. His wife shifted a bit, but didn't wake. He thought maybe he'd imagined it. Then it rang again. His phone vibrated in his hand with another alert. Haltingly, he tapped the screen. The grainy image popped up. A girl, maybe 10 years old, frilly white dress, hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, a mordant smile and hollow, vacant eyes. She looked at the camera quizzically, like she was staring back at him through it, just as confused as he was. She opened her mouth and wailed. She pounded on the door twice. Keith thought about waking Mary. She turned onto her side, facing away from him. Another knock. He lumbered out of the bed and put on his slippers, then crept down the stairs, unsure what he would do if he got down there. And there was indeed a young, oddly well-dressed child on his porch. As he got to the bottom of the stairs, there was another knock. His eyes fixed on the front door, he reached for the coat rack in the foyer and fumbled for an umbrella to, if necessary, defend himself. A strong breeze shook the bushes outside the bay windows in the living room, and brittle branches tapped against the glass. Keith put his hand to the door. He no longer heard anything. He pulled his phone from his pocket and glanced at the screen. The girl was still there, silently staring forward. After a few deep breaths, he peered through the peephole. Nothing. He pulled back, then took another look to confirm. He glanced at his phone again, and the girl was gone. He didn't fall back asleep that night. The next couple of nights, similar things happened. The ringing of the bell, the girl on the porch, the wailing and knocking. And then she would vanish, seemingly as sudden as she appeared. He never saw her through the peephole. He never opened the door. He never woke his wife. Never mentioned it to her in the morning. He would just lay awake in bed, alone next to her, wondering if he was losing his mind. So here's the deal with Keith and Mary. Rough patch wasn't really the word for it. They were in a perpetual state of stormy seas at that point. Fertility struggles can do that to a marriage. After 2 years of trying to have a child, way too much money spent on hormone treatments and drugs, having bland mechanical sex on a schedule, arguing, blaming themselves, blaming each other. They lived on the raggedy edge of oblivion, never wanting to dare the other to give them that final push. He would tell me they were still in love, and I didn't see any reason to doubt it. But getting through the day, dancing around each other, avoiding invisible tripwires embedded in every exchange of pleasantries, it was wearing on them both. You could see it in their eyes when they looked at each other, in the rare moments they socialized with friends together. So, no, he didn't want to come to her with, "I keep seeing this mystery girl at the door at night," because A, he knew how nutso that sounds, and B, what the hell was she going to do about it? He wasn't certain it would start an argument, but he wasn't certain it wouldn't either. That's about when he called me. We were old friends whose lives had taken very different paths since our days living across the hall from each other in a college dorm. He was a high school English teacher at some fancy-ass private school in wealthy old Moneyville, Connecticut. I was once an investment banker in Manhattan, and then some things happened, and then I quit. Now, I investigate paranormal occurrences, which is something most people don't take seriously until they experience a paranormal occurrence. Before that day, we rarely talked about our work. I didn't particularly care about his, and I never knew what he thought about mine. But he called me on the office line and said he had a problem, and he didn't know who else could solve it. I hopped a train out to Stamford on a Saturday, and I took a cab to their house, a 3-level home built in the 1960s that I'm sure the real estate listing called charming, like something out of a black and white sitcom. Picket fence, fancy shutters, old-timey mailbox, the whole deal. I knocked on the door, a 6-pack of moderately priced craft beer under my arm. "Who you gonna call?" I said, with a smile as he opened the door, and I immediately realized I'd woefully misread the situation. Keith glared back at me, exhaustion dripping from his eyes, ill-fitting sweatpants sagging off him like he'd lost a good 10 pounds. "Roy," he said, his voice like gravel and glue. "Get in here, and hurry." After I entered, he slammed it shut and locked the deadbolt. He glanced up the stairs towards the bedroom and motioned for me to follow him to the basement. We sat on a weathered old couch and he walked me through what happened. It had been almost 2 weeks. This thing showed up almost every night, knocking, wailing, vanishing. "Mary's starting to think I'm hiding something from her," Keith said. "Well, you are hiding something from her," I noted. "Well, what am I supposed to do? Tell her the truth?" I let that thought hang in the air for a moment, and then I moved on. "If we take care of this quick, she'll never need to know," I said. "That," he said, snapping his fingers. "I want to do that. How do we do that?" I pulled out my notepad and got down to business. I wrote down dates and times to the extent he could remember them, drew some sketches of the spirit he described, started trying to make some sense of it all. I took some readings with my equipment and confirmed that there was some sort of lingering spectral energy on the porch. "You have any photos or video of this thing?" I said. "I've tried recording it," he shook his head. "The file glitches out every time. For however long she's out there, it's just all static." "Oh, that's inconvenient." "Okay. This is important. Has she ever threatened you?" I asked, as I studied the doorbell camera. Nothing appeared to have been tampered with. "She doesn't say anything at all," he shrugged. "She cries sometimes." "Is it that she can't talk? Or she just doesn't want to?" "How the hell would I know?" he asked, taking a seat at the top of the front steps and resting his head in his hands. "I mean, when I don't open the door, she screams. This shrill, bone-shivering screech. Like, I don't know, like a banshee?" "Interesting." I made a note. "I know this is gonna sound strange, but has anyone been murdered or buried on the property?" "Oh, not that I know of," he said. "There are a lot of reasons a spirit might haunt someone. Frankly, it's helpful when they can talk. Otherwise, it's like trying to figure out what your dog is telling you when it barks at the window. They're usually looking for something or someone, some unfinished business on the mortal plane. Revenge, longing, lust, a deep, unabiding need for one last human connection. Under certain circumstances, it can be oddly romantic, maybe even a little sexy if you're into that sort of thing. Of course, sometimes ghosts just like to mess with you. This, I was fairly certain, was not that. What it was harder to say, from what Keith told me. The spirit didn't seem especially malicious, but it was persistent. and it was targeting him specifically. I wasn't even sure Mary would have been able to see it if she wasn't sleeping through these episodes. Back in his living room, I offered him a preliminary assessment of the situation. From the sound of it, I said, you're dealing with something a couple 100 years old, give or take. I suppose we can't rule out the ghost of someone who died on their way to a more recent Victorian-era themed costume party, but that really seems like a long shot. Anyway, this is probably some apparition that came untethered from whatever site it was originally haunting. Maybe it was a bad exorcism or whatever, but it's been floating about aimlessly for some time. Then latched itself onto your camera for some reason. Could have been at the factory, could have been after you installed it, doesn't really matter. Point is, it's in the camera. Keith stared at me blankly. It's a technogeist, I added. I honestly think you're just making up words. Face it, I said. You've got a ghost in the machine, my friend. Well, what do we do about it? I sank into the soft cushions of the couch as I thought about it. Forgive me if this seems obvious, but have you tried turning it off? His sheepish silence assured me that he hadn't considered that. It's not uncommon, mind you. People panic in the face of things they can't explain, and their response to something that doesn't make sense doesn't always make sense. Our brains aren't wired to deal with this shit. Folks like to mock characters in horror movies for making irrational and dangerous choices, but if you haven't been chased by an axe-wielding cannibal through the backwoods cemetery in the middle of the night yourself, I don't want to hear it. Murtaugh's Law, I said. The simplest solution is, like 65 to 70% of the time, the best one. Let's give that a go. The first night he left the camera off, Keith heard nothing from it. Stayed awake for hours just waiting, jumping at every sound, real or imagined. The next night he eased into as deep a sleep as he could recall. When he awoke, he had 3 alerts on his phone that motion had been detected. He raced down the stairs and out the door and confirmed the camera was still off. Unnerved, he yanked the camera off its base and spiked it to the ground. He attempted to stomp it with a slippered foot, nearly losing his balance. He picked it up, dumped it into a trash can, and dragged it out to the curb. By the time he got home that night, it was gone. Mary asked him what happened to the doorbell camera, and he didn't answer. Around 3 a.m. the next morning, Keith was jolted from his sleep by a muffled shriek. He tried to ignore it, buried his head beneath his pillow, hummed softly to himself, but he could still hear it. Mary managed to sleep through it all. After 10 or 15 minutes, he shuffled down the stairs. The wailing grew louder as he approached the front door. When he placed his hand on the door, the sound ceased. He cautiously lifted his head to the peephole. The girl was there, eyes without pupils, somehow staring back at him through the hole. He ducked down. Then the scratching started, tentative at first before growing more intense. Kneeling on the floor, he saw a shadow moving frantically on the other side of the door. He scurried back to the stairs and scrambled up towards the bedroom. He cowered under the covers. Mary shifted and stirred, but didn't wake. Eventually, he dozed off. In the morning, he considered that perhaps he had dreamt it all. But on his way out to work, he noticed the scratches on the door and the splinters of wood on the porch. He called me that afternoon and asked what other options we had. He didn't love the answer. I don't know what he told Mary to explain why I needed to spend the night. Maybe he didn't even bother with an excuse. By the time I got there, she was on her way out the door with an overnight bag. She glowered at me as I passed on the walkway with my backpack full of gear. She and I hadn't gotten along that well, even in the best of times. Inside, I posted some very basic warding on the entryway, a few sigils in the closet where Mary likely wouldn't notice. Simple but generally effective for keeping ghosts from crossing the threshold uninvited. After that, Keith and I sat in the living room sipping whiskey and waiting for his spirit to arrive. Look, if I'm right, it's essentially a homeless spirit now, I explained. Like a panhandler, if you will. If you ignore it long enough, it will eventually go away. What if I don't? Keith walked over to the bar and picked up a crystal decanter filled about a third of the way with a smoky golden single malt. I haven't been, a good husband, he said as he topped off both of our glasses. I know that. I failed her. Not by choice, not maliciously. I didn't cheat. I didn't hurt her. But I don't know. I made mistakes. Well, everybody makes mistakes, I replied, recognizing the emptiness of the platitude as I said it, but also not having anything more profound to offer. After a moment, he said, Mary wants me to see a professional. Well, I'm a professional, I offered. 100% not what she means, but thank you. Keith sat back and took a couple of long, slow sips. He looked towards the door, then up the stairs, then back at me. He leaned forward and spoke softly. We suffered a loss, he said. About 6 months ago, she was pregnant, and then she wasn't. We were still in the first trimester, didn't even know what we were having yet. But it was brutal. We had heard its heartbeat just a couple weeks earlier. She even had the audio file of it on her phone. Then we just lost it. I'm not unfamiliar with trauma. I've dealt with some crazy shit in my life, and a hell of a lot more of it in my work. I've consoled husbands and wives whose spouses were possessed, parents whose children were terrorized by haunted dolls, cat lovers whose pets were torn apart by hellhounds, but occasionally I do find myself wildly out of my depth. Keith swirled a melting ice cube around in his glass. He closed his eyes and muttered something under his breath. We don't talk about it, he said, louder. To anyone. To each other. The doctors said there was nothing we could have done differently, but, who believes that? You can't blame yourself, I said, because that seemed like the appropriate response. He swigged down the last of his drink and closed his eyes for a moment. Of course I can, he said. He sat up in his chair. So, the thing is, the way I see it, I lost an abstraction The idea of a child, you know? But Mary lost an actual living human thing growing inside her. You could see the pain weighing on him. The way his shoulders perpetually sagged, it occurred to me that a malevolent spirit could have been drawn to emotion that deep. But again, healing that psychological wound was pretty far outside my lane. "You're allowed to grieve," I offered. "Yeah, well..." His voice trailed off as he looked up the stairs. "I had this dream a couple months ago, back when I was still sleeping. Mary and I were in this shopping center, and I guess there's like a food court. I go up to this sort of generic Chinese place, the kind they always have in malls where they're handing out free samples all the time. And I order a couple bowls of fried rice. I don't know, Mary really likes rice. Not in real life, I mean, but in the dream. Which is weird in itself, but not the point. So the guy gives me a receipt, says he'll bring it over when it's ready. An hour goes by. We're still sitting there, and Mary's getting hangry. Finally, I'm like, fine, I'll go see what's going on. I walk over to the counter, and the guy says, "Nobody ever placed any orders." I go to pull the receipt out of my pocket, and it's gone. So I'm standing there arguing with this kid behind the register, and Mary starts texting me like, "The baby's losing his mind. Get back here," and I hear this faint crying that gets louder and louder, and I race back to the table, and Mary's sitting there alone, super pissed off. We get back in our car to head home, and I notice there's an empty car seat in the back. Mary turns to me and says, "Where's the baby?" And then I wake up. Keith stepped away from the stairs and gazed furtively at the front door. I peered down at my watch and saw it was well past midnight. Outside, lightning flashed, momentarily slashing through the darkness of the living room. As the thunder boomed, Keith's head darted towards the door. "Did you hear that?" he asked. "The storm?" I said. "No," he said. "She's knocking." He crept towards the door. I still couldn't hear anything. I pulled myself up from the couch and walked over to him. He placed his hand on the doorframe. The rain spattered against the window next to us. Wind whistled through dead leaves. I leaned forward and peered into the peephole. That's when I saw her. Exactly as he had described. A young girl, bleached white, a frilly dress, vacuous eyes. She tilted her head up as if sensing me watching her. I ducked back down, my mind racing through the inventory of tools in my bag that might be of use. Then I saw Keith's hand inch towards the doorknob. "You don't want to open that door," I said, grabbing his wrist. He shook loose from my grip and shot me an irritated glance. "Come on. What would happen?" "Any number of things. Literally none of them are good." He looked at the door, then back at me. "It's a girl," he said. I gently pulled him over to the couch and sat down next to him. I handed him back his drink and encouraged him to take a hefty sip. "I know that thing looks like a sweet, innocent little girl, but we have no idea who or what that is," I said. "It could be the spirit of an adolescent serial killer. It could be a demon." "Wait, demons are real?" "I operate off the assumption that everything's real," I said. "Demons, angels, Santa Claus. It's just easier that way. No surprises." "I really don't think it's a demon or a serial killer," he said, his eyes wandering back towards the doorway. "Or a demon serial killer. Or a demon serial killer. Demon serial killers aren't a thing, are they? I patted his shoulder and shook my head. You want to roll the dice and find out? A strong gust of wind tore through the room as if the door had been flung open. My head swiveled to confirm it was still shut. The lights in the kitchen flickered on and off. Plates and glasses rattled in cabinets. The soulful wailing Keith had told me about filled my ears. Just as suddenly as it began, the chaos stopped. Keith and I were alone in silence. I hurried over to the door and looked through the peephole at an empty porch. I made a sign of the cross on my forehead, whispered a brief protective incantation, and swung the door open. Rain dripped down my face and wind rustled my hair. She was gone. I closed the door and I locked it. Keith stared at me. So, he said, problem solved? I'm telling you, I said, returning to the couch. It will be back. Every minute that thing is attached to you or your house, you are at risk. Mary is at risk. It's not interested in her. He pointed up the stairs. She can't even hear it. I know it's here for me. I don't know how many ways there are to tell you that it's not a good thing. He leaned back and exhaled. It is what it is. We sat in silence for a while after that. I faded off to sleep at some point. I assume he did too. When I woke up, he was galloping down the stairs, fully dressed, fumbling with a bow tie. He stopped and looked at himself in the mirror that hung from the hall closet door. He gave the tie one more shot, struggling to untangle his fingers from a poorly formed knot that immediately unraveled. He balled up the tie and tossed it aside in frustration. I can show you how to do that, I said, sitting up. I'm a full service like that. I'll be fine, he said. I noticed his eyes drifting towards the front door. For real? You'd be surprised how much my job entails dressing up as a high-end waiter or chauffeur. I wiped a bit of drool off my chin. See, it's saying things like that that makes people think you're just a male stripper. Like I said, I'm a full service, I said as he passed, heading into the kitchen. Look, we need to talk about last night. Keith kept walking. He must have brewed coffee while I was sleeping because there was a steaming pot waiting. I followed him into the kitchen. I'll be fine, he said as he poured some into a travel mug. With all of it. I kind of think you won't. I took a stiff gulp of coffee and grimaced as it burned my mouth. Look, Roy, it's my mess, and I'm gonna deal with it. I released a heavy sigh. Do what you want to do, but you called me. Yeah, well, he surveyed the living room. I guess I shouldn't have. I packed up my bag and got ready to head out. Keith ushered me to the door and offered a somewhat unenthusiastic thank you as he practically pushed me out. Take it from a product of 3 divorces. I called over my shoulder before he closed the door. Talk to your wife before you don't have one anymore. But clients never take my advice. Apparently neither do friends. This is what I mean about happy endings and the lack thereof. Keith and I spoke a couple more times over the next month or so and occasionally exchanged texts. He insisted everything was fine, but he became evasive whenever I prodded for details. He refused to allow me to come back and sweep the house for spiritual activity. He rarely mentioned Mary at all, and I soon learned why. She called me one night, panicked, as Keith's behavior grew increasingly bizarre and troubling. She had been staying with her sister in Greenwich. She hadn't heard from him in almost a week. So she stopped by the house that day. She didn't want to barge in on him if he was home, so she knocked at first. While she waited on the porch, she heard giggling and creaking on the other side of the door, and she was certain she saw a child's eyes peek through the blinds. More alarmed now, she unlocked the door and pushed inside. As she described it, there were dolls and children's books scattered on the floor. The sigils I had drawn in the closet were crudely replicated over both the front door and the doorway to the backyard. Along the staircase, there were scratchy crayon drawings on the wall, stick figures, houses, sunshine, stuff like that. The television was turned on to some puppet-centric educational programming. When she stepped further into the living room, Mary found a girl on the rug in a tattered white dress. Her skin was pale and dry, mapped with cracks and wrinkles. The soles of her feet were dark with dirt and dust. Her teeth were charcoal black, and she emitted a faint glow. At first, the girl didn't acknowledge Mary, just sitting there rolling a small rubber ball back and forth between her hands. When she finally looked up, her eyes were empty. She smiled, and a spider crept through her lips and down her cheek. Mary screamed, and the girl's face immediately tightened up. Her abyssal eye sockets watered with black tears. She released a loud, high-pitched roar of anguish and anger that pushed Mary towards the door. Mary stumbled backwards onto the porch, and the front door slammed shut. Inside, she heard the deadbolt lock. That's when she did two things. Got the hell out of there and got me on the phone. I borrowed a neighbor's car and drove out to Connecticut as fast as I could. When I got there, the house was dark and silent. The front door was still bolted shut, so I circled around to the back. I smashed the glass on the kitchen door and reached inside to unlock it. Standing in the middle of the kitchen, I heard a faint thud beneath me. Then another, and another. I shook my head and walked towards the basement. I reached into my coat pockets and tightly gripped a rosary in one hand and a pouch filled with rock salt in the other. I opened the door and crept down the steep wooden stairs. The basement was partially finished, with a carpeted play area and a worn-out couch on one side and a washer, dryer, and sink resting on the cold concrete floor of the other. They were separated by a sliding wooden door. The laughter of a little girl echoed through the walls around me. When I slid the door to the unfinished area open, I saw him immediately. Keith's body lay on the floor in a corner that was about 1/3 of the way to becoming a guest bathroom, with partially installed equipment connected to untested water lines running into exposed brick walls. Fumbling through my pockets for my phone, I raced up the stairs to the kitchen. I dialed 911, though I could tell just from looking at him that Keith was well past dead. I'd been doing this long enough to know there was little point to trying to convince an emergency service operator a house is haunted. So I told them he was unconscious and unresponsive in the basement and left it at that. Of course, the police had questions when they arrived at the home of a childless couple filled with children's toys and drawings. I did not have answers for them. It turned out Keith had been dead for days. There was no obvious trauma, no signs of a struggle. Coroners initially assumed it was a heart attack, but up to that point, he had been a reasonably healthy man, and the autopsy was ultimately inconclusive. The cops found no evidence of foul play, so they wrote the whole thing off as a result of unspecified natural causes. I knew better, of course. But who is going to believe you when you insist your friend was murdered by an 18th century schoolgirl he found living in his doorbell? Once the police and EMTs cleared out, I slipped back inside the house through the back door. I needed to make sure that the spirit was gone, and it would be safe for Mary and others to return. There were no signs of supernatural presence even in the unfinished area of the basement, and that was reassuring in some ways, yet in others not at all. The house was clear, but this thing was still out there in the world of the living, and I had no idea where. I felt a draft as I stood there in the middle of the room, and I noticed the window above the washer was cracked open the slightest bit. So I pulled it closed and locked it tight for whatever that was worth.
Thank you, brave listeners, for joining me on another dark story. I urge all my listeners to go out and find more content by our weekly author, if you're not too timid. If you enjoyed today's story and you've tuned in on YouTube, please click the like button. And if you don't want to miss further stories, click the subscribe button. And if you are present today on Spotify and enjoyed the story, you're only more than welcome to leave a comment. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, please leave the show a rating as you see fit. All these little things help the show. And wherever you listen, please do me a favor and share today's story, if you can. Then tune in next week for another frightening tale, if you're brave enough.